I am delighted to welcome at least two of the three speakers. The third speaker, unfortunately, Eduardo cannot make it to be with us because he was actually coming from Washington, and nothing is moving in Washington, this time because of the snow. So he unfortunately is not able to join us, but we are hoping that at some other point he will be at BU and you will get a chance to hear him. What we are going to do today is slightly different from our seminars. We want to sort of launch formally, even though it's now been launched in Washington and elsewhere, the first Pardee Center task force report, which was on the future of North American trade policy. The task force reports is a series that we want to have led by Boston University faculty, where we look at issues of pressing global policy importance, bring together key people to answer specific policy questions in very specific ways. Okay, what should be done? And the question that this first one tackled was what should be done about North American trade, particularly NAFTA. It was particularly appropriate and particularly well timed because it came right after the election of President Obama, right as Washington was supposed to start thinking about the future of international trade. It has other things on its plate too. And it brought together some of the leading experts on NAFTA and on North American trade, not only from the US, but from Mexico, from Canada, including one from the UK. So brought them together to think about, okay, what should be done? And that's the nature of these task force reports. The task force is available to be picked up at the back, so please, if you haven't looked at it, I would strongly encourage you to do so. This was happening at the same time as a similar report was also being done at Carnegie, and Tim will maybe also mention that. So it was a very, very well-timed effort in the sense that it brought this confluence. And what we want to do today is to talk with two of the lead authors of this. Kevin Gallagher was the lead person for the Pardee Task Force report, looked at it, and he's going to launch us off. And then Tim Wise, a friend and old colleague, well, colleague for a long time, not old, from Tufts University, who is at the Global Development and Environment Institute, GDE there, is the other speaker. So without further ado, let me introduce Kevin Gallagher, who will take it from here. As I said, he was the lead person on this task force report for the Pardee Center. He's a fellow at the Pardee Center. He is a professor of international relations here at Boston University and has 20 other hats that he keeps juggling.
Thanks. Well, thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Professor Najam. I'm glad that all of you folks showed up in the snow. Not only do we have free food, we've got shelter for all of you, and hopefully something interesting to talk about. I want to apologize for Eduardo. He's in Washington. It's hard to get out of there. I'm in real trouble with him, though, because I promised him when I invited him to come here in December that we would get him out of the bad weather in Washington. And so when he comes back, it's going to have to be April, maybe even May, or I'm going to be in trouble. As Professor Najam said, the impetus was for this entire task force report sort of came out of the 2008 presidential campaign. When then candidate Barack Obama was a candidate, he pledged to review and replace the North American Free Trade Agreement model for both NAFTA and the future trade agreements that we were embarked upon. When he won the election, anticipating this debate that was going to occur, I decided to bring together some of the leading experts on NAFTA from Mexico, from the United States, and from Canada. And yeah, there was a guy from the London School of Economics, but he's an American who works a lot on intellectual property and public health in Mexico, to come here. And even though we've built a lot of our academic careers on looking on the impacts of NAFTA, we said let's not look backward this time. Let's look at the future. And for each person's specific expertise, we said, okay, how might NAFTA and future trade agreements be fixed so that we can ensure financial stability, economic growth, and sustainable development? And it turns out our timing couldn't have been better. We did the report. We had the first meeting in March of 2009, and then we took us 6 months, because we're academics, it takes a long time to do things. Took us 6 months to put together the report, but we finally launched it in December of 2009 in Washington. with major briefings in the House and in the Senate, and it just so happened to be the same week that the administration said that in March of 2010 that it would unveil its framework for a 21st century trade agreement that would go beyond NAFTA. And they didn't give us any details, so now this report is perfectly placed and perfectly poised to be part of this debate now of what the new template for U.S. trade policy is going to be. We thought for today's talk, Eduardo from the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace, Tim and myself did this sort of summary study that looked at all the impacts of NAFTA to serve as a backdrop. He was going to present that, but Tim Wise will start with that, and then I'll go over the majority of the findings from the task force report.
Thanks, Kevin. Nice to be here, and great to be collaborating with the Pardee Center. It's been a really wonderful collaboration and a great synergy between these two efforts. They actually, I'm trying to remember how they came to be and the genesis of which came first. But I think in effect we were working on them both at the same time, Kevin and I. The purpose of this one was that while it's questioned in the United States whether NAFTA has been good for the United States, and questioned in Canada, good for workers, good for the environment, it's generally accepted in policy circles at least that, well, at least Mexico is the undeniable winner from NAFTA. And that's not what the Mexicans we've worked with over the years will tell you. And so we wanted to essentially establish the factual record on what has been the economic impact of NAFTA and the NAFTA model on Mexico. Because, as Kevin said, Barack Obama stated very clearly that he was open to reviewing and revising NAFTA and other trade agreements. And we agreed NAFTA is a good place to start. Review should not just look at impacts in the United States, but should look at Mexico. And the NAFTA model has been overall a disappointment. So how has it been a disappointment? There have been notable successes. In fact, one of the most striking things about the disappointment of NAFTA is that it has been so successful in what it set out to do, and yet the results have still been disappointing. How has it been a success? Well, exports, Mexico set out to increase trade and investment, and it got trade and investment, partly because of NAFTA. Exports quadrupled in value, foreign direct investment tripled in value. They brought inflation down to a much more manageable level and reduced public deficits, and all of those were goals of NAFTA. What was unfortunate was that they found that those successes did not translate into dynamic growth and benefits for the majority of people in the country. Growth was slow. Overall investment levels were low, actually lower than before NAFTA. Persistent macroeconomic vulnerability, weak job creation, some progress in reducing poverty and not so much in inequality, more because of targeted programs rather than increased employment, and weak environmental protection. So what I'll do very quickly is run through what some of those results look like, and then we can move on to the sort of what to do about it, the Pardee report. Slow growth in spite of rising exports. Like I said, exports tripled in value, and Mexico, in fact, achieved the additional goal of transforming itself into a manufacturing exporter from being just an oil exporter. The top line is that exports is a share of GDP, and it's a very significant growth rate. The bottom line is per capita real income growth. And as you can see, the time before NAFTA showed higher growth rates than the time after NAFTA. It's been about 1.6% per year on average since NAFTA. This is before the recent downturn, which is Mexico's economy is down 7% last year. So Mexico's been incredibly hard hit. But 1.6% is very low It's low by Mexican historical standards. It was double that in the 60s and 70s. It's low by the standards of the kinds of middle-income countries Mexico is competing with in the international economy. And most importantly, it's low by the standards of what Mexico needed to create jobs. And that's probably the most striking finding from our report. Job creation overall has been tremendously weak, even in manufacturing where there were significant increases in exports. The two sectors, the maquila sector on the border, the sort of more protected export sector, and the non-maquila sector, there was actually a decline in employment in domestic manufacturing and a very slight increase in the maquila sector. But overall, you're only talking about 300,000 to 600,000 jobs, net job creation in manufacturing over that entire period. That's again very low for an economy that has 1 million new entrants coming into the workforce every year. Mexico needed jobs from NAFTA, and it didn't get them. It got a few more jobs than that in services, which depending on the numbers you use, you might find 4 million additional jobs in the service sector. Significant share of those are in the informal sector. It's harder to measure employment in the service sector, but agriculture has swamped a lot of these what gains there were in total employment. There have been 2.3 million jobs lost in agriculture as NAFTA opened up the border to U.S. exports. Mexico declined to enforce some of the transition period measures that they could have put in place could have enacted to slow the flow of imports, slow the transition to free trade. Instead, corn and a lot of other products flowed in, and livelihoods were lost. Prices went down for Mexican farm products, and 2.3 million jobs were estimated to be lost in the period since NAFTA was enacted. Overall, what that adds up to is an employment picture that's tremendously disappointing because 1 million new entrants into the workforce and nowhere for them to go. Mexico, probably the two biggest signs of NAFTA's failure for Mexico are that the number of people in the informal sector, this in a middle-income country, have increased from 52% before NAFTA to 57%, and this was before the recent recession. So 57% of the people in a middle-income country working in the informal sector is not a sign of development. Second, migration rates doubled since NAFTA began. NAFTA was promised to allow Mexico to quote-unquote export goods, not people. And what it's resulted in is Mexico exporting goods and people, both signs of serious weakness. There was also supposed to be a convergence in wages. The wages in Mexico were supposed to go up with manufacturing activity, et cetera. And instead, it's languished. It's still about, U.S. manufacturing wages are on average still about 6 times greater than Mexico's. And in fact, that gap has widened very slightly since NAFTA. Another problem for Mexico with the NAFTA model has been rising dependency in general on the United States for foreign investment, for export markets, and for imports in food and agriculture, the area that I work on. Import dependency has increased in virtually every key food crop. As you can see, the first bar is 90 to 92, the second bar is 2006 to 2008, and the food dependency has grown dramatically, particularly in key crops like corn. Mexico also faces persistent vulnerabilities that have been masked to some extent by the fact that it remains an important oil exporter. Mexico's trade balance overall, the top line in that graph, has been at a relatively acceptable level as a share of GDP. But that has masked a non-oil trade balance, which is a much more important measure, that has been in serious free fall in the last few years, but before that was at a troubling level as well. And that puts Mexico, again, at it's down, the non-oil trade balance is now at a level that it was before the peso crisis in 94, 95. Again, a very, very worrisome sign. What we concluded in this with Eduardo Zepeda, we came up with some conclusions and recommendations that are actually very consistent with what we found in the Pardee report. Yes, indeed, the United States should review its trade policies and make them consistent with the development needs of partner countries. In other words, it should be a benchmark of a successful trade agreement for the United States that our trading partners are growing and growing dynamically. And that's particularly important for developing countries with which we're trading. Why? Because their excess labor flows across our border. Their drug problem is our drug problem. Their problems are ours. Trade agreements do need to raise up the quality of life and the standards of living, not just in the United States at the expense of other countries, but in theory, they're supposed to lift all countries. Key to that is promoting job creation. That's not just opening up trade and investment, that's actually targeting government policies to direct trade and investment into areas that can create jobs. Better protection of the environment. If you just open things up, you're going to get greater environmental degradation. The estimates are that environmental degradation since NAFTA has averaged about 10% of GDP. The costs of environmental degradation, that's swamps, the growth rates that Mexico has seen. And finally, it's important to respect the right to development. That said, we recognize in this study that NAFTA isn't the cause of all these problems. And we recognize as well that the Mexican government, and probably this is the lesson for developing countries, made a serious mistake in equating trade policy with development policy. By opening up its trade, it said we don't need a development policy. A development policy is our free trade policy. And in fact, that's a huge mistake. And any developing country should learn from that mistake. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Kevin.
Thanks. So the report that we did with Eduardo Zepeda in a lot of ways summarizes a lot of the work that a number of us have done over the past 10 years on the impacts of NAFTA in a concise way that policymakers can use as we look at these debates. And we use that as a backdrop for the Pardee Task Force report. Here's a list of the folks from Mexico: Enrique Dussel and Rodolfo Garcia, Americans Ken Chatelain and Bob Stumberg from LSE and from Georgetown, and then from Canada, Gus Van Harten. And as I said before, each one of these folks they've got a CV full of NAFTA impact studies, a lot of which is summarized in the report that we did. But here we said, okay, since there's going to be a debate on the future, what are some of the specific things that we can do? There's no way in my 10 minutes that I can talk about every single one of these proposals, so I'm going to, Tim and I are each going to focus on one of them. But in the question and answer period, we can talk about labor rights, we can talk about environment, we can talk about intellectual property rules and public health, and we can talk about migration. Those are some of the issues that we're not necessarily going to talk too much about now. I'm going to focus on investment because in many ways the flaws of the investment part of the agreement are some of the deepest that have hurt Mexico, not only Mexico but the United States and Canada as well. This table right here shows in the red line foreign investment as a percentage of GDP into Mexico after NAFTA. And the blue line there is total investment. So this is foreign investment plus private sector investment in Mexico plus government sector investment in Mexico as well. What you find here is that foreign investment has tripled since NAFTA. However, there's been little to no impact at all. It's actually been a slightly negative impact on the level of total investment, which is now down below 20% of GDP at the similar levels that it was during the lost decade of the 1980s. Economists are pretty much in consensus that you need to have total investment as a percentage of GDP to be around 25% in able to get sustained growth to be able to develop. What happened was the foreign firms came, which is a great thing. you got your foreign investment, but they displaced a lot of the private firms that were there beforehand. A lot of their domestic counterparts went out of business, which accounted for a lot of these employment losses. And the government wasn't able to step in and fill the investment gap. So you see declines in total investment. And most economists that have done regression analysis to try to account for the reason why Mexico's had so much slow growth, the number one reason is the fact that there's been little to no investment. That investment levels have been low, and that's had a significant impact on slow growth in the region. And so in part, this has to do with the investment rules in the agreement. And if you look at the investment rules that places like China, South Korea, and Malaysia have under their trade agreements, they have a lot more flexibility to try to get the red line to impact and pull up the blue line. And we'll talk about what some of those are. The task force report has basically 5 recommendations for this. First and foremost, we recommend that the dispute resolution system for the investment chapters be put in line with the dispute resolution for the rest of the treaty and more in line with the way that the WTO works. Interestingly, under NAFTA, just in the investment chapter, just in the part that deals with foreign investment, foreign investors have greater rights than their domestic private sector counterparts in all 3 NAFTA countries. They have this because they are allowed to privately sue a government in a private World Bank tribunal over disputes. Every other part of the treaty, if I have a quibble with another country's practices, my government has to take the Canadian government or the Mexican government to a NAFTA-sponsored transparent tribunal where we'll fight out our dispute, very similar to the way that it works at the WTO. For foreign investment only, and for foreign investors only, not domestic private sector investors, foreign firms can directly sue private governments in a closed World Bank tribunal. And there's been a number of egregious disputes that have made governments in Mexico and Canada, not yet the United States, fork over an incredible amount of money to foreign investors. However, we've won some significant cases. The second most important proposal that we put forth is that all countries in U.S. trade agreements need to have the policy space for industrial development. One of the reasons why we're losing competitiveness to the Germanys, to the Chinas, to the Malaysias, and the Brazils of the world is that they only fall under WTO investment rules, which give countries a lot more flexibility. For instance, when China gets a red line like that, and theirs is even steeper, they can bargain with the foreign firm a lot more than Mexico or the United States can and try to put together a joint venture, try to encourage the company to buy some of their inputs from the local suppliers and so forth, and get the benefits from foreign investment to trickle throughout the rest of the economy. Countries under NAFTA and U.S. trade agreements have not been able to do that for a long time. Thirdly, and this gets a little technical, but in these investor-state disputes, foreign firms have been winning cases when a country puts forth a new public health or environmental law. Foreign firms have been taking governments to these tribunals on the grounds that that new law either caused an unstable regulatory environment for that firm, or some go so far to claim that that new law is tantamount to expropriation because it incurred cost onto the firm that they didn't foresee when they made the initial investment. And so then they take a government to one of these NAFTA tribunals at the World Bank and sue the government for the damages that they have to pay to adhere to an environmental law or a public health law. Luckily, the United States just won a case against the Canadians on this, and we recommend that future trade agreements, including a fix of NAFTA, codifies the U.S. position that just won. Because what's odd about these tribunals is that there's no precedence like a normal U.S. court. It can be totally different the next time, and you'll have to see. And so the Glamis Gold Corporation operated a gold mine in California. California passed a new law to make them clean up a lot of the cyanide and fill in some of the holes that they made and so forth. And the Glamis Gold Corporation took California to a World Bank tribunal and said that California disrupted the regulatory environment and needed to pay major damages to the Glamis Gold Corporation. The U.S. luckily won and said, no, that's too broad of an interpretation of what fair treatment for firms are in a country. And we recommend that the language that tribunal agreed on in the case when the U.S. won, that be inserted and codified into future trade agreements. Fourth, perhaps the most hot thing, and unfortunately the most hot thing in trade policy right now, is the concern that our recommendation is you need to broaden the prudential exception to make sure that governments can prevent and mitigate financial crises. A lot of the measures that the United States and other countries around the world have used to get out of the financial crisis, and some of the ones that we're formulating now as we put together financial regulatory reform, are actually inconsistent with our trade commitments. If you think about it, one of the basic principles of trade policy is that you have to treat your domestic firms the same way you treat your global counterparts. Think about it for a second. Did any foreign auto companies in the United States get bailed out during the U.S. auto bailout? No. Did any foreign banks get bailed out during the TARP program? No. And there's a big concern that the French or the credit banks like Credit Suisse might file suits against us because we didn't bail them out. And there's precedent for this. This happened in the Czech Republic during a financial crisis that they had in the 1990s. So it's really important that these trade agreements don't run against our efforts to try to prevent and mitigate financial crises. I'll skip the last one because I've almost used all my time, and I'll let Tim quickly talk about the agriculture one, but you've only got 2 minutes, and then I'm going to go beyond. Actually, since you talked about the general impacts, just do the recommendations.
Yeah, I mean the basic trend is that a lot of developing countries, such as Mexico, still have a lot of smallholders growing staple food crops. They're living off them. They're selling them in regional markets and opening up the borders to free inflow of cheap imports, highly subsidized imports in some cases, often dumped at below the true value of production, undermines those markets and undermines livelihoods. That's what we saw in crop after crop in Mexico. The graph Kevin passed over was for corn, which is, an estimated 3 million people in Mexico still grow corn. So you're talking about the green line is the producer price drop, and you're talking about 40, 50, 60% producer price drops for Mexican producers due to rising imports, which is what the bars are. What can you do about that? Well, if you're willing to reform NAFTA, you can do a lot, and there's interesting debates going on and discussions, creative ways to address these problems, such as at the WTO. So I recommended that we borrow from the WTO. Concept of special and differentiated treatment for less developed trading partners means that Mexico isn't subject to the exact same rules as their developed country partners. What would that look like in agriculture? Again, from the WTO, the special products designation allows you to designate a developing country to designate, if the Doha round ever gets enacted, would allow developing countries to designate a limited number of key food products that are key to food security, key to livelihoods, key to rural development, for extended protection from liberalization. SSM stands for Special Safeguard Mechanism. That was the big debate with India and the United States over regulations, temporary regulations and protection to limit import surges. Again, exactly what Mexico saw under NAFTA, huge import surges with the opening of the market. And Mexico didn't have the right anymore to impose limits and to slow that import surge and to limit the abrupt impact on its producers. So that's borrowing from the WTO. Borrowing from the European experience, and this is one of our overarching recommendations from both the Carnegie report and the Pardee report, is the need for attention to financing for development. That is, the need for investment to bring a less developed trading partner into more of a reasonable trading relationship with its developed counterparts. And in agriculture, that would look like credit, infrastructure, and public investment in the productivity of the smallholder sector so that they can compete in a more global environment. This is all critical to the migration issue, which was another chapter of the Pardee report, which I won't go into. But the problem with all of this is that, and the reason NAFTA really needs to be reformed and needs to be reopened, if Mexico is going to benefit from any rethinking of trade policy, is that NAFTA locks in every one of these bad policies. It would be illegal for Mexico to do any of these things now under NAFTA.
Thanks, Tim. As I said, we had authors and specific reports on labor and labor rights, which we can talk about during the Q and answer. A lot of things about the environment, although we both touched on them to a certain extent. Issues around intellectual property for innovation and public health. We have three general conclusions for the entire report, though, and that consistent across both reports is that NAFTA and the NAFTA template need deep reform, and trade agreements need to address the asymmetries among trading partners. Often what the U.S. model has been is almost exporting a U.S. regulatory model to countries that are nowhere near U.S. regulatory standards yet. And third, Tim talked about this already, that trade agreements are not substitute for coherent national development policies, that you can't expect to sign a trade agreement and for everything automatically to be good for your country, whether you're a rich country or a poor country, that you need collateral institutions, collateral policies to be able to get the best out of an agreement. And again, I'll point to China. China entered into the WTO and has really maximized its entry into the WTO, perhaps too much so for many of us to like. NAFTA is just sort of, Mexicans sort of signed the agreement, thought that the agreement was going to take them to high levels of development, and it certainly didn't. Here are the covers of the two reports. You can actually take away a hard copy of the first one that's in the back there, but if you're just an electronic person, there is the URL to download the Pardee report, and on the right there, here's the URL to download the report from the Carnegie Endowment. So we'd like to spend the rest of the time having discussions about this. We don't only have to discuss the issues we talked about, as again, we covered a whole bunch of things here. Thanks a lot. I think they're going to click the light on so we can wake people up. Here we go.
Looks like there's a mic to be passed around. If people have questions, just raise your hand.
Jeff.
Do you have any sense of what the prospects are that these results will be heard? In other words, what is the process by which this publication translates into these being in some way acknowledged in public debate? And do you have any thought of what, in the best of circumstances, that acknowledgement might lead to? So there's the political road ahead. Do you have any thoughts about?
What's your format? Do we take a bunch of questions and answer, or we do one at a time?
I'm Jeff Rubin in the History Department and at the Institute for Culture, Religion, and World Affairs here at BU.
Yeah, great question. As I said, the timing of these two reports couldn't come better. I don't want to be too naive, but the administration, Obama on the campaign trail, made a number of promises and has implemented at least the process to make the changes that he talked about. Throughout all of 2009, there were a number of reviews that occurred in the U.S. government on previous trade policy and what the new model should look like. I was actually, for disclosure, I was appointed to the investment subcommittee of the U.S. Department of State's Advisory Committee on International Economic Policy, and we were the group that just looked at investment rules. And so there's been all sorts of processes like this that have submitted proposals for reform that are now being kicked around in the administration, and they're going to unveil this, it seems like, in March of 2010 for a new trade agreement that they want to sign called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would be New Zealand, Chile, Peru, Vietnam, Australia, Brunei, and a couple others. So the good news is these ideas are right there in the middle of a debate that'll go on between Congress, the administration, and the general public on how to shape a new agreement. It will not pass. The Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement will not pass if it looks like NAFTA. That's the good news. The bad news is it's harder to go back and fix something in the past. And there's been some indication that the administration is going to do a handful of tinkers on the side to NAFTA, just related to environment and labor, and rather than go in and do some fundamental changes. So the good news is that some, thinking optimistically, Future trade agreements might look a lot better than NAFTA, but it's much harder to get Canada and Mexico back to the table and to make fundamental changes there. There are a lot of things that the Canadians don't like about the agreement that the U.S. doesn't want to discuss. Many of the things that we talked about here, certain parts of the Mexican government don't want to change, and you're to a certain extent opening up a whole new kettle of worms. So I'm relatively optimistic about future trade agreements, but I think Mexico is going to be left behind. And that's a real problem, because with all due respect to New Zealand and Brunei, Mexico is our third biggest trading partner, right there, and they're our neighbor. And we absorb the migrants. They're a key export destination for a lot of our products and so forth. And we have a real interest in Mexico being better off. The statistics that we summarized in this report usually end in 2007, 2008, and if you're not familiar with what's happened in Mexico, the current account balance is now, even with oil, is 11% of GDP. Their fiscal deficit is over 5% of GDP, and they're in really bad shape. They're considered one of the, they're definitely in the worst shape in the Western Hemisphere outside of Haiti, of course. And we have a real interest. It's better for us to be preventative. When they had a huge crisis in 1994, we had to orchestrate $30 billion to go in there and bail them out. It's better to prevent that kind of thing from happening in the future.
Yeah, if I could add just one thing to that, I think the big debate in Washington right now is what seems clear is that the Obama administration and to some extent Congress is committed to incorporating the so-called May 10th, 2007 agreements, amendments to the NAFTA template into future trade agreements, and some that have been passed, including the Peru agreement. Those are definitely improvements to the labor provisions, improvements to the environmental provisions, some improvement to the intellectual property provisions. What our both reports were very clear on is that any reforms need to go well beyond that. Certainly on the Carnegie report, we concluded that that having those in place in NAFTA would have made virtually no difference to the kinds of trends and impacts that we saw in Mexico. And so reforms really do need to go deeper. That's where the struggle is going to be, because I think there is a certain commitment and acceptance that those so-called May 10th reforms should be part of new agreements. The question is whether it'll go beyond that.
Hi, I'm Tom Nagel, IREP program here at BU. Switching over to the domestic policy, or remaining in the domestic policy issue, there were entrenched interests from labor that were strongly against adopting original NAFTA. What sort of interest groups are likely to play in domestic politics towards in adopting these sort of changes?
Yeah, there's a real coalition of U.S. interest groups that elected the president for the most part, and is the reason why he pledged to do a lot of this stuff that are really galvanized right now. There's actually a number of strange bedfellows in changing this, because the dragon in the room is that the United States in November announced negotiations to sign such a deal, a similar deal just on investment provisions with China. And so for the most part, a lot of our trade agreements are with countries where we are the major exporter of capital, and we aren't receiving that much foreign investment from those other countries. And therefore, we don't get too many of those suits against us, those investor suits, except for under NAFTA, where Canada has sued us. They tried to with this Glamis Gold thing. So there's the traditional constituency, which is the U.S. labor movement. They just put together actually their version of this report and submitted it to Congress on Monday of this week, where they have a whole template for what future trade agreements should look like in the United States. Environmental organizations are doing the same thing. But with those, I think political scientists say that there's Baptist and bootlegger coalitions, and that you could call looking back at some of our alcohol prohibition legislation way back, but that there's also domestic firms and domestic government, local governments that are concerned about having to withstand suits from China and other countries. So there's a lot of activity in Congress. There's actually a bill called the Trade Act, which has 105 co-sponsors, which would implement a lot of this stuff. And those are the Congress people that hosted us when we did briefings on this topic.
Yeah, and that's actually an interestingly growing group of people. The Trade Act essentially is mandating a set of benchmarks for trade agreements and a review process that allows for a public review to see if past trade agreements and future trade agreements meet those benchmarks. It's getting an interesting. It's very unlikely that such an act would pass, but it's growing following, and co-sponsorship is an indicator of, particularly in a recession, I think, how concerned people are about the prospect of giving away jobs, which is what dominates these discussions.
One of the things, I don't say this so much in Washington, and I know this is on video, so I probably shouldn't, but a big concern is that U.S. politics is driving the change. And from someone who's really concerned about economic development, that's a little concerning. Because when you look at the Trade Act and when you look at a lot of efforts to reform U.S. trade policy, sometimes development doesn't fit. Because there isn't a huge economic development constituency in the United States. And a lot of experts outside of Washington, like ourselves, are trying to make the argument that Tim noted, that it's important for our trading partners to grow. It's important for them to develop. We shouldn't see it as a zero-sum game. Right? Their gain is not our loss. Their gain is a larger export market for our products. Their gain is cheaper imports for us, which are implicitly higher income gains. When these countries don't do so well, and in the worst case, when we have to go bail them out like we did with Mexico in 1995 in a financial crisis, that hurts us. And so we're trying to bring in not an altruistic, but a real hard economic level of discourse about the importance of making sure that trade policy is also an enabler of economic development with our trading partners.
Tony Diazzo, retiree. I'd like to know if it's a correct assumption that many of the jobs that had gone into Mexico, not only your local producers were being displaced, but now those jobs that were created and are heading overseas are heading towards, say, China or the Far East because of the favorable policy in terms of, mainly in terms of payments, in terms of salaries and so forth. So the cost of production is a matter of almost pennies compared to a dollar. In our country, it'd be maybe $6 production. Is this a fact? But just some observations I've been able to make.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't plant this question because I don't know this fine gentleman with the great question, but it's a perfect way for me to advertise my forthcoming book with Stanford University Press called The Dragon in the Room, China and the Future of Latin American Industrialization. And a lot of Mexicans, when they hear Americans being up north talk about how NAFTA has had plus or minus impacts on Mexico, they say, we're over the NAFTA debate. We're concerned about China. And Mexico had a perfect opportunity because they had almost exclusive rights to the U.S. economy up until 2001 through NAFTA. But then they started to share that with China when China enters the WTO in 2001. And I've published a number of studies that have shown that Mexican market share in the U.S. has slid considerably, and it's statistically correlated with their Chinese counterpart exports in the United States. So each year in my economics class, we have a big class of 200 undergraduates, and I make all the students go home and write down the tags, the countries of origin in all their clothing, and the countries of origin in all their electronics. And unfortunately, I've been teaching for a long time now. I love teaching, but it's been a long time. But I have a nice time series in the beginning. A lot of people's clothing and a lot of electronics came from Mexico. Now, last semester, I had 117 students, and there was not one piece of electronics or not one piece of apparel from Mexico. It was all from China, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam. And that's an anecdotal story, but in studies that I've done, it shows that the same thing happens in the hard data. So Mexico is losing competitiveness to China, and I argue that that doesn't mean that we should be fighting China. I think we have a lot to learn from China, and that's what I was implying earlier here. China's trade agreements give them a lot more flexibility to try to build industrial competitiveness, which Mexico or even the United States just can't do anymore. And rather than being filled with fear about China, I think we have a lot to learn from them.
I mean, in fact, one of the things we skipped over, it's a hard graph to read, but Enrique Dussel-Peters, Mexican economist who participated in the task force, and wrote on manufacturing, had a really interesting and provocative perspective. This is a graph that puts 1990 at 100, an index, and the top line is Mexico. The darkest line is the NAFTA region as a whole, and it's manufacturing employment in the NAFTA region. And he says, no, the United States isn't losing jobs to Mexico. In Mexico, we say, what jobs? We're all losing jobs. And North America as a region has a competitiveness problem. And we should approach that as a North American region and develop a competitiveness agenda for manufacturing in key value chains, such as garments and textiles, such as autos, and find a common strategy for investment, innovation, to address the competitiveness problem that we have with Asia. I mean, he pointed out there are actually a number of areas where I think there's a value in thinking about the North American problem rather than the U.S. problem versus the Mexican problem in a competitive sense. The wage gap graph that we showed, showing that wages were stagnant in Mexico and hadn't gained, also shows that they're stagnant in the United States. The other trend that's not shown here is the productivity increases have been very significant in both countries. So what that says is that we all have a problem with productivity increases not being shared with workers, not being reflected in rising in rising wages.
Choi from Kennedy School. Making a little bit of the extrapolation from NAFTA, actually, towards the 2001, there was some kind of academic debate in ECLAC and UN in Santiago, Chile, considering that expansion of or enlargement of NAFTA, not in the same fashion, towards southern hemisphere. So including Brazil, the Mercosur. So what is the prospect at the current juncture of the so-called free trade of the Americas?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, there's been about, one of the most fascinating things about the past 10 years is that poor countries have been growing faster than rich countries. Mexico is not included in that group. But on average, the relatively developing countries have been growing faster than the richer countries. And that's been led by these so-called BRICS, Brazil, India, China. Some of us think that Russia's more of a submerging economy than an emerging economy. I don't leave Russia in that group. But Brazil being a key one for the Western Hemisphere. Brazil is in a lot of ways the Latin American counterfactual for Mexico. That the way that Brazil has developed has looked at, especially on the industrial level, they have been much more strategic about developing an industrial sector and much more strategic about issues related to public health and emergencies and so forth. And so they basically stopped the free trade area of the Americas. The United States wanted the free trade area of the Americas to look like NAFTA, and Brazil had a very significant proposal that was very WTO-like, but for a Western Hemisphere, for the Western Hemisphere. And there was such gridlock on the two that the two sides just decided to go their separate ways. That's the good news for Brazil. But the bad news is that the United States entered into a policy called competitive liberalization, where they said, gosh, we're having so much trouble in the FTA or the WTO with these darn Brazils, these darn Chinas, these darn South Africas who won't sign the kind of agreements that we want. And so what we're going to do is try to, in a geopolitical kind of way, surround them with trade agreements the way that we want. And so we started agreements with Chile, which is a small economy, the Central American region, the Andean region, all very small economies that also had preference schemes with us dating back from the Cold War, where they had special access to our economy. And we said, we're going to deny those special access to you unless you sign a free trade agreement. The good news is we'll give you those preferences forever. The bad news is you've got to sign on to this intellectual property. So Brazil and Argentina have been able to carve out a space for themselves and still can use a lot of different policies. but we've lost. Central America has an agreement just like NAFTA. The Chileans have an agreement just like NAFTA, although Chile is really hoping that this Trans-Pacific Partnership, which will supersede the U.S.-Chile agreement, will be an opportunity for them to, to sort of change some of the things that they reluctantly agreed to in 2003.
So in that context, is there any possibility of concluding the Korea-U.S. free trade agreement?
I don't live in Washington. I don't know about that stuff.
In Washington, what you hear is that, well, the going wisdom in Washington from anybody who works on trade is no trade agreement will ever be brought to Congress in an even-numbered year because of elections. And it's considered really bad politics to go back to vote for a trade agreement when you're running for election. That doesn't sell well at home in a lot of districts. So I think what I've heard from our allies in Washington is that it's very unlikely that those agreements will be brought to a vote this year, but they're not going to be dismissed either. And there seems to be continued interest on the part of the administration in trying to get them signed eventually. The debate is over in what form. Will they be reformed trade agreements along the lines that Kevin and I have been talking about, or will they just have minor changes to labor and environment provisions and be submitted as such?
Julius from Pardee Center. What I wanted to know, given the fact that these kind of trade agreements now have been there for some time, whether you looked at other regions, the experiences, so that what can we say, what has worked? Is there any trade agreement that has worked particularly well, so that as we try to design new trade agreements, we can be able to say this is the best way to do it? And also, do you think actually it's possible to write down an agreement that will stand the test of time? Because usually you write an agreement, and as you said, China enters WTO and everything changes. So what are the challenges of crafting something that can actually stand the test once it's in place?
I think as a general framework, though I'm critical of many aspects of it, that the World Trade Organization is where global economic policy at this level should be discussed. Economists will show you that the gains from trade liberalization are the largest when countries liberalize trade multilaterally. That you can actually distort trade with tiny trade agreements around the world, and countries aren't going to produce where they have a true comparative advantage. The other key thing about the WTO is that it's a one country, one vote system where every country's vote counts in the final agreement. And so therefore Brazil, India, China, South Africa have been, since they have a lot of market power, they've created a lot of coalitions with developing countries around the world and have been able to shape the WTO to have a lot more policy space than many regional trade agreements that are often a function of market power in rich countries. And if you look at the performance of the East Asian economies, they've been able to use the WTO to their benefit. There's a lot of room to cut deals with foreign firms and share technology. There's a lot of room to think about strategic industries and how to become more competitive. I'm critical of a lot of some of the WTO policies, but it's a much better forum. One, because the economic gains can be better there. Two, because the actual institution is a lot more fair from a developed and developing country perspective.
Also, I'll be the one to tout a study that Pardee published by Kevin and Rachel Thrasher, who's a fellow here, that really compared from a development perspective the provisions of different types of agreements, EU agreements, US-style free trade agreements, the WTO, and South-South trade agreements that among countries in the developing world. And certainly one of the takeaway findings is that from a development perspective, the South-South agreements are certainly the most development-friendly in terms of putting the fewest restrictions on so-called policy space for pro-development policies. And the US agreements are among the worst. So that may get at some of what the questioner was asking. And that's right on the shelves here, right, Adel?
I think that's an important point, but Just for the record, I don't want to portray the United States as the big bad imperial trade policy folks. What we are putting into our trade agreements is very much in our short-term interest. And so there are huge political constituencies around forging the kinds of agreements that we have that will benefit a lot in the future. What a lot of us are arguing is if you give, if there's more flexibility, it'll give us more prosperity in the long run. And so yes, by not allowing another country to break a patent for an antiretroviral drug and save its AIDS population, yes, a U.S. firm is going to make a heck of a lot more money than they would now, than in the case if the patent was broken. But if countries can develop their own drugs to be able to serve their populations, it's going to cost us a lot more money and a lot less lives into the future. And we've got to think more long term. Since we're in the Pardee Center, that's the core way to think about these things, and they have to be thought of in the long term. The end of your question was, well, what do we do about the long run? A lot of the trade agreements done by the U.S. are permanent, which is why the administration, even though it may want to open up NAFTA, it's having a hard time doing it. One of the great things about the WTO is they have what's called rounds. And when the global economy changes, 5-6 years down the road, the internet gets invented. Wow, that changes the way the global economy works. Maybe we need to reopen the WTO and think about that. That's commonly done. There's been 10 or more trade rounds under the WTO since 1944. We don't think that way in our regional trade agreements, and we should. It's completely, it's got all the legitimacy in the world, but we've locked in a picture of the U.S. and Mexican economies in 1994 without China in the world economy as the way that we're going to govern trade with one of our biggest trading partners. It's just insane. Well, thanks everybody for coming. This has been a great discussion. We go back to the last one so we can tell people what the URLs are. We encourage you to take a look at the reports themselves and continue this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My thanks to both Kevin and Tim for a very interesting, lively discussion, and to all of you for coming here. Thanks for the plug on the previous publication, which actually just came in, and we have extra copies of both that and an earlier paper that Rachel Thresher and Kevin had done on trade. This might be a good time to also plug that later this year in September, we will be having a conference here on South-South economic relations. So very much in line with the spirit of that question, looking at economic relations amongst developing countries. A lot on trade, but not just on trade, as was pointed out. These links are greater than that. So thanks once again. We have a little black box for each of our guests, and we have our gratitude for all of you. Thank you very much.